Ambassador Shivshankar Menon, and dear participants, good afternoon and welcome to a very special, nice webinar on India's security challenges. To speak on this very important topic, we have very distinguished speaker, former National Security Advisor and Foreign Secretary of India, Ambassador Shivshankar Menon. Ambassador Shivshankar Menon, we are really honored by your kind presence. I have always been fascinated by your lectures since I was studying in Delhi. Mr. Menon, please allow me to briefly introduce our institute, NICE Nepal. Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is an independent, apolitical, and non-partisan think tank which believes in freedom, democracy, and world free from conflict. We envision a world where sources of insecurity are identified or understood, conflicts are prevented or resolved, and peace is advocated. Neighborhood Studies is one of our major research centers here at NICE. Ambassador Menon needs no introduction. However, as a tradition, let me introduce Ambassador Menon formally. Ambassador Shivshankar Menon was a distinguished fellow with Brookings India and is currently a distinguished fellow with the Center for Social Economic Progress. He is chairman of the advisory board of Institute of Chinese Studies in New Delhi. Ambassador Menon served as a National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister of India from January 2010 to May 2014, and as Foreign Secretary of India from October 2006 to August 2009. A former diplomat, a career diplomat, he has served as ambassador or high commissioner to India to Israel, Sri Lanka, China, and Pakistan. He was a member of India's Atomic Energy Commission from 2008 to 2014. Ambassador Menon has also served in India's missions to International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna and in the Department of Atomic Energy in Mumbai. Ambassador Menon has been a Richard Wilhelm Fellow at MIT and Fisher Family Fellow at Harvard University in 2015. He is also a member of the Board of Trustees of the International Crisis Group and a distinguished fellow of the Asia Society Policy Studies Institute in New York. In 2010, Ambassador Menon was chosen by Foreign Policy magazine as one of the world's top 100 global thinkers. Ambassador Menon studied at the Scindia School, Gwalior and St. College, New Delhi, Delhi University, where he studied ancient Indian history and Chinese. His book Choices Inside the Making of Indian Foreign Policy was published in 2016. Mr. Menon, kindly make a remark in 20-30 minutes, which will be followed by question and answers. The program is streamed live on Facebook, so we request all our participants to drop their questions either on the Facebook Live or in Zoom chat. Please do share our live video on social media so that maximum people can benefit from the lecture. Over to you, Mr. Menon. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jaiswal, and thank you to NICE for having me, for asking me to speak to you today on an enormous topic, actually, on India's security challenges. But what I thought I'd do is I'll speak for about 20 minutes or so, making a few simple introductory points, and then maybe we can open it up to questions and answers, because I'd really like to hear what you think and to respond to that, rather than to just give you a lecture. So how does India approach a security calculus? I mean, what does she look at as important security environment, and what sort of environment do we think we're operating in today? Frankly, we're fortunate. Today, there is no external existential threat to India. And this is not something we could say about India at various stages immediately after independence, when there were existential threats, including threats of separatism and so on, none of which are. That doesn't mean that we've solved all our problems. We still have security challenges. But how do we approach those? Frankly, like any national strategy, I mean, we approach them and make a hierarchy of threats depending on how they affect our national goal. And our national goal since independence has been agreed across the political spectrum for a very simple reason. When we became independent, frankly, our condition was abject. One of the world's richest and most advanced societies had been reduced to one of the poorest and most backward. And therefore, our task in India is to transform India. That's our primary task. And the function of security professionals, frankly, and the way we look at security is to provide sufficient security for the transformation of India. Notice that this is, and there are some Indians who think this is a very defensive goal, but it is a necessary goal. When India became independent, our life expectancy was around 20. Hunger, couldn't feed ourselves, we're importing food. It was obviously the one thing we had to do. We had to transform India into a prosperous, secure, modern country. And this is agreed across the board in the political spectrum in India. There might be differences on how we get there, on which is the best way there, which is the quickest, the most efficient way. But that's not the goal itself is quite clear. Notice, this is not a goal to revise. This is not a territorially ambitious goal. This is not a goal which says that we have to go out and export our ideology. We are not a city on the hill. We are not here concentrating on the external environment, except insofar as it enables us to transform India. So, in essence, this goal, the transformation of India, this gives us a very simple calculus and a hierarchy of threats and opportunities and challenges. Obviously, the most serious security challenges would be those which threaten our territorial integrity or the integrity of the country as a whole. That would be number one. But then after that, it would be those threats which have the potential to derail or prevent the transformation of India. That would be the most important. There would be a second order of challenges of things which could affect the transformation of India, and which would not maybe prevent it or be such serious threats to the transformation. So if you have a hierarchy of challenges, if you can construct a hierarchy of challenges based on the national goal, in the Indian case, for instance, obviously territorial integrity comes number one among the security challenges. And therefore, one of the first tasks that the Republic of India did was actually to try and agree its borders with all its neighbors. And most of it is done except in Kashmir with Pakistan and with China. But apart from that, the maritime boundaries, the land boundaries are by and large done. There might be small areas here and there which we might differ on, but basically it's done. Separatism, as I said, is under control, is manageable. There is no real threat to India as there might have been in the 50s and early 60s. But then you get to other issues which can affect India's transformation. There is a whole host of other issues. And this is where a ranking of threats becomes important, because we don't have unlimited resources to address these challenges. And we have to pick and choose where to put our effort. There are some things which are critical to India's transformation. India imports energy and relies on the world for energy, for non-ferrous metals, which we happen not to have, and today for technology, for capital as well. And these are things which can affect the transformation of India. And therefore, we work on the external environment to try and create an enabling environment which enables us to overcome these challenges. But basically, if you look at it, you look at India's security policy abroad, and this is why India has therefore, over the 70-odd years of the Republic of India, essentially played has played a role abroad, which is basically meant to enable India's own transformation. India has not gone out seeking enemies, interfering in other people's affairs, sending troops abroad or creating military bases abroad, because the purpose of security and foreign policy has been, as I described it just now. But what has happened in the last 2 decades has made this calculus more complicated. And the real reason is that the distinctions between internal and external security challenges have been obliterated especially, and this is actually, it's been going on for a long time. The world has globalized, the world economy has globalized, and increasingly we are dependent on the rest of the world. When India began sort of radical reforms in 1991, 15.3% of GDP was external merchandise trade. By 2014, this was 49.6%. This is just external merchandise trade, trade in goods. Not counting services, not counting remittances. If you look at the external sector, is more than half of India's GDP. So our fate is actually tied to the rest of the world to an amount which I'm not sure that everybody quite understands in a very big. So globalization is one phenomenon which has actually obliterated that distinction between internal and external. The other, of course, is technology. What the internet, what the ICT, the communications revolution has done is to eliminate that distinction. And we've seen this, the creation of a whole new domain, cyberspace, which recognizes no national borders. Countries might try to build great firewalls to try and impose national sovereignty in cyberspace, but that's not a very successful attempt so far. And the technology itself tends to obliterate those distinctions. Thirdly, geography. What technology has done to geography has also changed. I mean, there was a time when distances really mattered, when mountains were barriers, huge barriers. No longer. Today, we do things in the mountains, including fight wars, which we never used to do 1 century ago. But most of all, the distinction in India's case between internal and external security has been obliterated by our development imperative, because our resource endowment is such that India actually needs to work with the rest of the world if we are to transform our own economy and to develop our own society. Throughout history, and this is really the lesson of our history, India has done best when she's most connected to the rest of the world, when she is most engaged. And it is those portions of India which are most connected to the world, which have been historically the most advanced. If you look at Indian history until about 1850, when frankly manufacturing, technology, commerce were as advanced as anywhere else in the world. And whether it was the Kanto Plains, whether Zhejiang, Fujian, parts of China, East China, in India and in Northwest Europe, it was those parts of India, Gujarat, the Coromandel Coast, Vanga in the larger sense, which were most connected, which were actually the most advanced and the most prosperous. And today we are in a situation where, frankly, this is true of most of the world. So what does that do to India's security? For one thing, we can no longer think of just the territorial boundaries of India as affecting our security, because, as I said, we are connected to the world economy. We need the world for energy, for our own changes. And when we look at global phenomena, whether it is terrorism, global terrorism, whether it is cybersecurity, suddenly, because we are connected to the world, maritime security becomes very important. When you look at that, then frankly, your whole perspective on security, the issues that become your challenges, becomes much broader than just what do I do about policing my immediate home. That is no longer a sufficient definition of security for India or for any country in today's world. So what does that do to the way we look at the subcontinent? I think the obvious conclusion, for me at least, is that frankly, the entire subcontinent, India cannot progress if the rest of the subcontinent does not. That India's security depends also on the subcontinent being secure. We cannot just say, oh, we'll do well within our own little territorial boundaries, but to hell with what happens all around us. And that's not just true of India and the subcontinent, it's also true of India and Asia as a whole, for all the reasons that I mentioned. that you cannot draw that distinction. So in other words, we have to start thinking of our common security, our common prosperity. Most of the challenges that we face today in terms of security, and there's a whole new agenda of security that I just mentioned, whether it's maritime security, whether it is cybersecurity, whether pandemics, as we saw through 2020 and still face today, whether it's the peaceful uses of space and preventing its militarization, whether it is global terrorism. These are not issues that respect boundaries or that any one of us can settle for ourselves and just lock ourselves up and deal with. We need to work with each other, and we need to work together in the subcontinent, but also in Asia as a whole. So for me, therefore, the logic of our present situation and of our present security calculus is that we have to work with our partners. And the first place we have to do that is in our home, in the subcontinent itself. But in Asia, which is our larger home, seeking common security and common prosperity. If you look at the recent history of the subcontinent, it's, I think, natural that, most of us look to the rest of the world for what we can get to develop our own countries, to overcome our own issues. But South Asia as a whole has done very well over the last decade or so, both economically and, I think, frankly, politically. This might not appear so when you look at the daily headlines in the newspapers, but the fact is that we have overcome civil strife, civil wars, at least in 2 of the South Asian countries. We have got much more stable political systems. Economically, South Asia has done well as a whole. And we have done this because we might be one of the least integrated economically. We do only 6% of our trade with each other. Most of our trade is with the rest of the world. But we are actually integrated in various other ways and have tremendous affinities which give us advantages. In fact, I'd be very happy to talk about that in more detail, maybe during the question and answer. But the other shift that has happened in the recent past is that today determine Asian geopolitics. For instance, the Indian Ocean today is actually, if you look at the center of gravity of world economic activity, it's energy flows, trade flows, containers, and so on, or even data flows. If you look at submarine cables, it's the Indian Ocean that carries these. You look at the major fault line in global geopolitics today, which is frankly the rise of China and the pushback against it by established powers. That's also right next to us. You look at the third big phenomenon that we face, which is the consolidation of the Eurasian landmass and the increasing integration of the Eurasia as a whole. All these phenomena, frankly, make South Asia much more important. Why do I say this? Because during the Cold War, frankly, South Asia was a sideshow. The primary geopolitical fault line was in Europe, between the Soviets and the Americans, and the Fulda Gap represented it in Germany, the partition of Germany. Today, that's not where the geopolitical focus of the world is. That's not where the contradictions are. You look at all the hotspots in the headlines today. Where are they? They're all in our region. They run through from the East China Sea to Taiwan, to South China Sea, to the India-China border, to Yemen, we are bang in the middle of this. And so whether we like it or not, I don't think South Asia has any choice but to actually not just take note of it, but actually be a participant in global geopolitics and geoeconomics, whether we like it or not. I don't think we have a choice. And that's my fundamental message to you, to my Nepalese friends. Our fates are interlinked. But we are today actually in a dangerous world where there are many more security challenges which are much more complex than the traditional challenges that we used to think of. And with this new security agenda, I think we really need to work together to try and address their consequences for us. Today, we're in a world where the future is very uncertain, and not just because of COVID and the pandemic, but frankly, because there is no global order anymore. You've seen the ineffectiveness of the multilateral organizations, of the traditional structures in the face of COVID, in the face of the pandemic. You've seen how the global economy, now the entire prospects are actually dim. We might all think that we are going to grow in 2021, but that's because we had such a global crash in 2020. So frankly, given this uncertainty, and this is both geopolitical and economic, given this uncertainty, my message would be, let's work together, let's find common security and common prosperity in this, because it's in our interest, it's in our own interest. And frankly, it's, for me, the only way forward out of today's situation. I'll stop there and maybe leave it to you now to say what you think and to tell me where I'm wrong.
Mr. Menon, thank you very much for your remark. You have touched upon the major security challenge that India faces today, and it is always fascinating listening to you. We have lots of questions, so I think I'll move directly to the question and answers round. We have received around 30 questions from different platforms, so without any delay, let me please share the questions that we have received. The first question is, what security challenges does India face in Indo-Pacific region? How important is Quad, and what benefit does it bring to India?
Well, I think India's interest in the Indo-Pacific region is very simple. Most of our trade in 1991 used to go west through the Suez Canal. Today, something like 38% of our trade by volume goes through the South China Sea. Our biggest trading partners are really across the Indo-Pacific, China and the US, but also all our other trading partners, Japan and the others with ASEAN. So for us, maritime security through the space, keeping it free and open for all of us to use peacefully is very important. Now, the Quad is a security dialogue whose level has steadily increased because, frankly, there are other people who share exactly the same interests. But the Quad is not the only answer to the problem. This, after all, is a common interest of most countries across the Indo-Pacific, all the way from the east coast of Africa to the west coast of the US. And I think the best definition of how we look at Indo-Pacific security was probably Prime Minister Modi's speech at the Shangri-La Dialogue in 2018, where he spoke of an inclusive security architecture which would guarantee that the Indo-Pacific would stay free, open for trade, for peaceful uses by all of us, because we all benefit from this. And this is now, as I said, the center of global economic activity. This is the most dynamic economic region in the world. If we want growth, if we want to grow out of our problems today, that's the place to be. So security there becomes very important. And that is really India's security interest in the Indo-Pacific.
Thank you, sir. Let's move to the second question, and then we'll request Ambassador Vishnu Prakash to pose his question. The second question is, a few days ago at a panel hosted by Hudson Institute, you said that India has a larger China problem, both continental and maritime. Indo-Pacific and Quad help India in the latter domain, not the Eurasian domain. What role, if any, will Central Asia play in India's competition with China in Eurasia?
You know, I don't like using this word competition with China. I don't think we are. In fact, that's not our business. That's why I said our job is to transform India, not to go winning some notional competition around the world. That's not our job. We're not constructing a global order. We're not in competition with anyone. We want to transform India, and we don't think that transforming India is actually against anyone else's interest. In fact, it's actually in their interest to see India rise, to see India do well. But when I said we have a larger China problem, what I meant was that unlike the other three members of the Quad, who are primarily separated from China by water, by the oceans, and who are primarily maritime powers, all three of them, we have a land border with China, and that boundary is disputed by China. And we've already fought one war. So that is something that we have to deal with. Primarily, it has to be between India and China. In the last month or so, we've made some progress in ratcheting down the tension that started last year, from spring last year on that border. We still have a long way to go. But frankly, I feel that both India and China have enough experience, are sensible enough to know how to do this if they want to. And ultimately, we have to therefore think of the China issue for India, therefore, is more than just a maritime issue or just an issue of the Indo-Pacific. It's also a continental issue. It's also a question of how the BRI changes operating environment, not necessarily share to the same extent. That's what I meant when I said we have a larger problem. That doesn't mean that I'm a pessimist about being able to manage that problem. It's just that it has different dimensions in the Indian case than it might have for the rest of the world.
Thank you, sir. Now I would like to request Mr. Vishnu Prakash to raise his question. Vishnu, sir?
Thank you very much, Chair. Am I audible?
Yes,
Yeah.
sir.
Sir, first of all, another excellent thought-provoking talk. Thank you very much. Pramod ji had mentioned about your book choices, which was very well received. When do we expect the next book coming? That is one. Secondly, you mentioned you very rightly that India instinctively is non-interventionist. At the same time, we talk of ourselves as the net security provider in our region. We talk of being the first responder in our region. And in 1988, you know that we had successfully intervened to foil a coup attempt in Maldives. 2014, we were the first responder. Now, given all these factors, is it feasible for India to continue to be non-interventionist, especially given the fact that our interests are not just regional, sub-regional in South Asia, but they go beyond it? So, is it can how long can we sustain that posture? That is one. Related to that is that we are a member of Quad, and as you said, it's a dialogue, but it does talk of being able to provide, or at least the agenda is also to enhance security in the Indo-Pacific region. So, given that fact, and if there is a situation in the Indo-Pacific region, can we keep our hands off?
Uh, yeah, about the next book, Vishnu, 21st of April, the publishers tell me. It's on India in Asian geopolitics, and it's called India and Asian Geopolitics, the Past, Present. But let's see. I have my fingers crossed that we
Thank
can
you.
keep these dates. About non-interventionist, I think the point I was trying to make is that our goal, and by inclination and our previous practice, suggests that we're non-interventionist, but today security issues don't respect borders anymore. And this is why I said this distinction between internal, external is now thinner and thinner and thinner and almost non-existent for a huge host of security issues. And where we have intervened so far has been at the request of a legitimate government abroad, whether it was Sri Lanka, whether in '87, whether it was the Maldives. In each case, I mean, it has always been at the request of the legitimate government where we have gone in, whether it was Bangladesh as well, and we have withdrawn as quickly as we could, pulled our troops back. So that's what I meant when I said non-interventionist. But I think that is less and less likely to be sufficient solution to the kinds of problems we face today in a world which is globalized in every sense, in a security sense also. So therefore, I hope that what we do we do together with our partners abroad. And that we continue to work on this principle, that we will respond to requests from legitimate friends and partners, and we will work together. So how does India become a net provider of security? By working together with partners. And I don't think we can guarantee, certainly not India, not other countries, nobody can guarantee the security of the subcontinent unless all of us together in the subcontinent actually work together. I didn't say, but I have been toying with the idea, and frankly, I don't have a conclusion here. But I do think that what SAARC tried, just doing social and economic progress, is no longer enough. That maybe it's time that we went beyond this and that we had a conversation among ourselves, because I don't think that we need to feel threatened. Our nationalisms need to feel threatened by the idea that we actually work together on common security problems. I mean, issues like maritime security, cross-border terrorism, these are common problems for everybody. And I don't see why we shouldn't have a conversation somewhere. I don't know where. But as I said, I haven't thought this through yet, but I think the stage has come where we have to go beyond it. So at least when I've used the word net provider of security, I mean, the caveat is along with our partners together at the request of the legitimate governments concerned. I mean, that would be. So Quad, for instance, Quad is never going to be able to guarantee Indo-Pacific security in that maritime space unless it works with other people, unless it's Quad Plus. I mean, ASEAN is there. It will have to work with other people and get them involved. So you can have a dialogue, discuss the issues. My own mantra for this is, and you've heard me say this before, issue-based coalitions of the willing. Those who have the intent, those who have the capability, come, sit around the table and let's do something together about these problems that face us all. So I would say you need a sort of flexible variable geometry here. You can't say here's one organization, one thing which is going to solve all our problems. No. Do issue-based coalitions of the willing, depending on the problem. And it's worked. You've solved piracy off the Malacca Straits, and you did it with a coalition which you put together. You didn't, I mean, you and others put together, Singapore and the others. You did the same to piracy off the Horn of Africa in the Gulf of Aden. It works. And it's a pattern where it's up to you how much you want to put into it, how much you want to participate, but you must sit and discuss these issues which affect us all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. The next question is, how important is Nepal for India's security? Where is Nepal in the case of India's security affairs? And there is another question related to Nepal. It is posed by a former Nepalese diplomat. There was an agreement reached in December 2012 between India and China, signed by you as a National Security Advisor and Chinese representative Dai Bengguo, agreeing to discuss tri-juncture border areas only at the presence of 3 countries, context border adjoining India, Bhutan, and China, including Doklam. However, in 2015, during the Indian PM's visit to China, India and China, only 2 nations, agreed to open disputed Dipu Lake, as Nepal strongly claimed on it, for trading and pilgrimage without consent of Nepal. The agreement of 2012 is equally relevant in the case of tri-juncture Dipu Lake, as well as violated the agreement understanding by the 2 nations thereof. So what is your view on this regard?
Just to correct the record, in 2012, Taipingko and I did not sign any agreement. What we did was to summarize what we and previous SRs, special representatives, had done so far in our work. And we reported that to our government, saying this is what we have done, this is what we've agreed, these are the things that we haven't agreed, but we listed, and among the things that we listed that we had agreed was this idea that tri-junctions naturally will have to be settled by all 3 countries involved. Now, in the particular case of Dipu Lake, we had no reason to suspect that there was a dispute here because frankly, Dipu Lake has been used for the Kailash Mansarovar Yatra, not just since its resumption after for then Foreign Minister Vajpayee's visit in 1979. And I know because I remember going on foot when we actually opened up the route to begin with. But actually in the 50s and 60s, right through that period. So I don't think you can say that the 2012 understanding of what we had achieved in the SR talks applies to Lipulekh, and we had no reason to think so at that stage. That was not in either our mind or the Chinese mind. The Chinese didn't raise it, we didn't raise it either. Is Nepal important to Indian security? Of course it is. It's critical to Indian security. And this is why we have had such close relations. Why is it critical? Not only because we have an open border, because we have cross-border ethnicities, we have populations working in each other's countries, much more Nepalese actually in India, not just because of frankly, the open economy, the open society, but also because, as I said, I see the subcontinent as a unit where we can't have India secure and Nepal insecure, or Nepal secure and India insecure. And we saw this during the civil war in Nepal. When we saw the effects, when that happens, and what happened? Ultimately, we worked together. India had an interest in peace in Nepal and contributed to it. If you look at what we did from 2004, 5, 6, and we worked together. It was primarily a Nepalese issue. The Nepalese are the ones who solved it, but where we could, we helped. Where they needed help, where they said, can you do this, can you do that, we did. And for me, that's a good pattern because our security, as I said, is common, is interlinked. We cannot think of these as separate. So Nepal is very important to India's security, as are India's other neighbors in the subcontinent.
Like you just mentioned about ASEAN, so then we have another question. What is the perception of India towards ASEAN in terms of security? How India and ASEAN can cooperate on security matters?
I think ASEAN's, as I said, maritime security has become an increasing concern as our connections with the rest of the world have grown, as the world is globalized, as we are more and more dependent on trade, and over 90% of our trade is carried over the oceans. Secondly, our economic relationship with ASEAN has grown tremendously. And this is the most dynamic economic region in the world. So quite apart from any traditional links and so on, ASEAN's importance to India and to India's security has steadily grown. And it was recognition of this that led Narasimha Rao, Prime Minister Narasimha Rao in '92 to first speak of Look East, which under the present government has become Act East, and where frankly, we have built, and if you look at the last 15 years or so, we have actually built up our security, defense, economic, other relationships with ASEAN countries to a level which we've actually never known before. So it is something that this is part of the point I'm making, that we can no longer sit at home and hope to ensure our own security or prosperity, the two major goals of any state.
So let me move to internal security, because we have received lots of questions on internal security as well. Could you talk about quote unquote domestic terrorism within India in the name of religious and political ideologies? How does it affect the transformation of India globally? And there is another question, where is India's internal security if we compare Manmohan Singh's tenure with current Narendra Modi's regime?
Well, I don't think, internal security is dependent on the personality of the Prime Minister. That's not, for me, if you look at internal security in India, it has essentially changed. It's changed in very fundamental ways. And again, primarily in the last 2 decades or so. And the primary driver of this has been urbanization. Today, India is on the brink of becoming, having a majority of its population in cities. And what this has meant is that the traditional roots that people have had in their home, their village, their family, their clan, their lineage, wherever, and where most people spent their whole lives living, working, etc., in one place, that is no longer true in India. There's a huge migrant working population which has come to the cities. We are on the brink, as I said, of becoming primarily urban. And the other thing that's happened is that, frankly, the ICT has brought the world into the palm of your hand, into your mobile phones. Everybody can see what's happening all around the world. So you now have social media, you have the politics of emotion, you have the ability to reach people in numbers and in places which you never had before. So it's changed your politics. India coped with the changes. The third big problem, of course, for India was cross-border terrorism, and both internal but primarily external terrorism through the 80s and 90s. But India learned to deal with that. And if you look at all the indices of violence in India since the beginning of this century, every one has gone down, whether it is separatist violence, whether it's terrorist violence, anything. What has gone up? Communal violence, which tells you how people have been shaken from their roots. And the other thing that has gone up is crimes against the person, social issues, things like rape and so on. Now, some of this might be just that people are now willing to actually report and do something about it. People are conscious of their rights. But some of it, I think, is also an increase with this whole social churning that you're undergoing. So you are now dealing with a very different set of internal security issues from what the old policing and so on is designed for. And I've been saying for some time that therefore the answer is to reform the way we look at internal security. External security in India has changed steadily, whether it was the military, which went through huge reforms in the 60s, again in the 80s, and again is undergoing a fundamental reform now, whether it's intelligence, which was when after 65, 62, we separated external intelligence and again learned lessons from Kargil. Look at MEA today is so different from any MEA that existed in the past. So external, the instruments of it, we created a National Security Council. We've become a nuclear weapons state. So our external security instruments have evolved and changed very rapidly, actually, in historical terms. That's not true of our internal security organizations and apparatus, basically. And it's probably time that we shifted that. But I wouldn't exaggerate the risks of domestic violence, of internal, what I think the questionnaire called internal terrorism. I don't think we should. In fact, those numbers actually are down. And the secular trend is for them to decline. And by the way, you can see these on I think it's the South Asia Terrorism Portal or on the MHA website, on the Ministry of Home Affairs website.
Thank you, sir. Let me move to China again, because we have a huge number of questions on China. Is rising China a real security challenge India is facing? Should India see China as a threat or an opportunity? What should India do to counter China's string of pearls policy?
Well, I don't know that China claims to have a string of pearls policy, but certainly China's rise has changed the security situation within which we operate and has raised a whole new set of challenges. One of them I mentioned already, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, for instance. The other is, and this is really a problem, because China's rise creates naturally countervailing forces. I mean, established powers, nobody hands over power happily. Nobody likes to share the global power. And as China rises rapidly in the international order in terms of economic power and military power, while she's still a regional power, at least in the region, she is rapidly becoming a predominant power. What uses she puts that power to is really the issue. India doesn't have a problem with China rising. Why should we? But what uses will she put her power to? Will she interfere in neighbors' internal politics, which she didn't used to 30 years ago? She only used to in the Maoist days when she exported revolution. But she didn't under Deng, or she'd cut it back. Will what she does externally, commercially, be open and available to everyone? Will it contribute to globalization or not? We don't know. And so those are the kinds of new challenges that we have to look at. Of course, we have a bilateral problem on the boundary. And it came, you saw, we had deaths on the boundary in 2020 for the first time in 17 years. In 45 years. So we really need to recalibrate the relationship. We had a longish period of about 30 years or so from the mid-1980s onwards, where we basically followed a live and let live policy, both sides, where I won't bother you, you don't bother me, we'll maintain the status quo on the border, keep peace and tranquility on the border, and we'll cooperate where we can internationally, but we will develop the rest of the relationship. And that sort of work, that model, more important things to do. Both countries had their own internal changes, their internal reforms, and their dealings with the rest of the world. But having done that, today that no longer works. And we saw that last year. So we need to recalibrate, reset that relationship. That's something we'll have to do together, both India and China. And let's see where that goes. It's too early to say that we will either succeed or fail at this. But for me, nothing is certain except change.
So let me move to another question, which is related to climate change and security. How is India going to address climate change issue as an emerging challenge to national security?
I think it's one of the most serious long-term threats to our security. And here again, it proves my point. This is not an issue that we can settle ourselves or we can deal with. It's not India's doing. It is what India and the rest of the world do that will determine what happens on climate change. And frankly, we should make a beginning ourselves, among ourselves in the subcontinent. When you see what's happening to our glaciers, when you see what will likely happen to our rivers, I think it's time that we actually got our act together within the subcontinent itself and started doing things. There have been attempts, there have been beginnings, but I think now that the nature of the crisis is apparent to everyone, it's taken a while. I mean, it's not that everybody was ready to accept how serious climate change was as a threat. But now they're in the subcontinent and find ways of dealing with this. But in the global negotiations also, I think that now actually a majority of WTO members have said we should do what we did for HIV/AIDS medicines and make them available, waive IPRs, make them available to countries that can't afford them, and at least deal with the pandemic. And surely this is an overriding humanitarian need, and it's provided for in the rules, which we've all agreed. And yet, the advanced countries won't do so. And I think we face the same problem in climate change. Everybody swears by climate change. It's like motherhood, that we must do something. But then they all practice family planning. That's the problem. I don't have a solution. I mean, I wish I did, but I don't have a solution to offer. But I think we can start at home among ourselves.
So let me move to cybersecurity. How does cybersecurity challenges affect India's national security? How do India tackle the problem of new challenges like cyber attacks?
Well, actually, India has been, for several years, the second most targeted country in terms of cyber attacks. Some of it is straightforward mapping, espionage, but a lot of it is malicious stuff. I mean, and even innocent things. I remember in my time, the Commonwealth Games, the scoring system was being attacked thousands of times. Why would you fiddle with the results of a Commonwealth Games? Malicious streak thinks this is wonderful, that you can fiddle with the results. But India has suffered for some time. We've been very conscious of this. In fact, we've been conscious of it from the time the National Security Council was set up in the late 90s. And from the early 2000s, we've started trying to set in place a system. But, it's a problem that keeps evolving with the technology. So the speed of attack, the difficulty of ascription, deterrence doesn't work the way it does, say, in nuclear. So you need to develop a whole different way of dealing with it. Ultimately, you can only rely on resilience. There is no guarantee of 100% security in cyberspace. And you need to find ways around the problem, ways of managing the problem, which we have been trying. The most important is to change the way you think of security in cyberspace. What is worth protecting and what is not. I assume that nothing I do online is private, that everything I do is open. But states can't do that. States have to keep some secrets. States have things that they want to keep from each other. But you have to decide what is important to you and what is not. And we've been working at this problem for quite a while. And I don't think we have done too badly. But the real problem in cyberspace is that there's no distinction between defense and offense. There is no way you can prove that what you're doing, because the same tools that you use for defense are also offensive tools. And this sets up an escalatory cycle, because you think you're doing things only to defend yourself. Maybe your intent is good, but everybody else thinks, he's now ready to attack me. He has the capability. So you've actually worked yourself into a security dilemma without meaning to. And that's what we have witnessed over the last 2 decades, where frankly, so today we're not safe in cyberspace. None of us are safe, even these big cyber powers. And we don't trust each other. We don't think that any rules of the road or laws or any agreements that we sign are going to be implemented. So this is one area where actually I'm much less hopeful than in the others. But I think we just have to learn to live with a much more insecure world in the cyber domain than we have been used to in any other domain. And the amazing thing is how humans actually cope. If you think of how terrified human beings were in the 50s of the atom bomb, and look at us, we've learned to live with it. We actually, how many of us really worry about, can you get 10 people out to demonstrate against the atom bomb? Today, you think of those old MRD rallies in 58, 58, 59, millions of people. But this is, as I said, not an area that I'm very confident of.
So we have another question which might not fully fully suit to our topic today, but still, did India-Pakistan joint statement yesterday came as a surprise to you? And what do you think India?
But I'm very happy.
Okay. So what do you think
India? Yes, because I'm not part of any government, anything. I had no idea they had done this, but I'm very happy they did it.
So other parties, what do you think India could have considered to Pakistan to arrive to this understanding?
I'm not going to speculate. I'm not going to guess what's going on when I don't know. All I know, my rule that I follow in these things is there's sure to be much more that you don't know, but don't assume that what you don't know doesn't exist.
So next question is, what is India doing to strengthen its counter-terrorism and to understand the discourses of terror groups these days?
I'm not sure what you mean by understanding the discourses of terror groups. They're so busy pushing it out, you don't really need to make too much effort to understand them. They know what they're saying, and they're busy pushing their message out every which way possible. If you look at India's counterterrorism record, it's been relatively successful, at least in terms of, by the normal measures of casualties, all those figures have actually come down. Number of incidents, security personnel killed, innocent civilians involved, etc. And in most cases, we have also been successful in addressing the roots of terrorism and the political, social, economic, other roots on which terrorism has flourished. And the proof of that, I think, is in these figures. I mean, why do these figures matter? Because, but we do have 2 or 3 long-standing issues. One, of course, is cross-border terrorism, and the causes of that, I think, are well known. I don't need to get into that. But the other is that unless we can transform India, unless we can develop India into, as I said, a prosperous, modern, safe society and economy, we will leave people behind. And this is where recent patterns of development, which have increased inequality in society, these actually need to be arrested. So for me, the long-term answers to this kind of terrorism, we might be good at the day-to-day business of counterterrorism and are getting better and better at it, as the figures prove. But the long-term answers to this is really development. And that's something that so far India hasn't done badly. In the last 30 years, India certainly did well.
We have lots of questions on India maritime security. So another is like, what are the changes in India's maritime security post 2611? Has the government done enough to deal with such emerging threats?
Well, government's done a great deal to strengthen coastal security, to integrate what we do on land by the police, the marine police, the Coast Guard, and then the Navy, and to make sure that the gaps between them are not what they used to be in the past, which is frankly what you used to worry us. And so whether it's enough or not, only time will tell. I mean, all security measures are sufficient until they are defeated. And this is a case where so I'm not going to jump to some conclusion saying, yes, wonderful, now we can relax and go home. No. But I do think that Government of India's concentration on maritime security has been good, has paid dividends, and is going to be increasingly important in the future. But here again, and I keep going back to my fundamental point, we have worked very hard with our partners, with Sri Lanka, with the Maldives, with Seychelles, with Mauritius, and I think we are now doing so in the Bay of Bengal also, even though there might be differences between our partners among themselves, say between Myanmar and Bangladesh and so on. But I think it's important that we all have a common interest in maritime security in these maritime spaces around us, and that we work together and continue to build on that. So I think both legs of it, creating Indian capacity and working with partners, I think both those actually have progressed considerably in the last few years.
So we are running out of time, but still we have lots of questions, around 40, 45. It's so difficult for me to choose the questions. So the last question for today is that there's a question by a scholar. He said that I see the growing participation of private companies and the American influence as a growing security danger for India and the world. Do you see a dependency on defense production as a danger? Indian military industrial complex, question mark.
I think we're a long way away from an military industrial complex in India. I see dependence on imports of defense products as actually more dangerous than relying on private sector or anybody else. My own answer to this question of should it be private, should it be public? I mean, there's no guarantee that public sector is any more efficient or any more patriotic than private sector. They're all Indians. But as long as you build competition into the system, it should work. And build competition between public and private, between several private. And we have successful examples of this. If you look at the Indian space program, the entire civilian space program, right from the outset, they chose to develop technologies, take it out put it in the private sector, but create at least two, very often three. And this is all the way from Satish Dhawan's time as chairman of ISRO. And then let them compete. And it's worked. And it's worked well. And I don't see any reason to question the patriotism of any of these people, whether they are private or public or whatever. But I think you need to create an enabling environment through policy where they are enabled, where they can compete on equal footing with the public sector, but most of all with the external environment. And it makes sense, frankly, for India to work with outsiders to bring defense production into India. I think it's happening, but I think maybe we need to accelerate it.
Thank you, sir, Mr. Menon. Thank you very much for the wonderful discussion. We learned a lot and it was really beneficial to us. I'm sure our participants immensely benefited from it. We still have lots of questions, so we wish to invite you again in future, maybe in real here in Nepal. I would also like to thank all our, thank you for your presence. I'd also like to thank all our participants for their wonderful question. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Pramod. Thank you very much. It was good of you.